first, Will.
That happened last time. Hello. I'm all prepared for Matt to say, welcome to Crowd Church. And it's me.
Well,
hello, my name's Will. Welcome to Crowd Church.
Yeah, and I'm Matt. It's good to be here with you. Is that how I talk normally?
Welcome to Crowd That's Church. Absolutely how you talk, Matt, yeah.
The big booming welcome to Crowd. It's great that you're here. We are, in fact, online. I can see we're online now, which is great. So do say hello in the comments. It'd be great to hear from you. Let us know where you are watching from, because tonight we are talking about
the origin story of all origin stories. The very beginning of the world.
Dun, 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 dun. I did stitch you up a little bit there.
Yeah, absolutely. You always do. You always do. Talking of origin stories. No, it is orange. It is orange. I finally got around to making marmalade, which is something I do every year. And this weekend has been my marmalade weekend. And did you know the origin story of marmalade?
Paddington Bear.
No, okay. Absolutely not. Apparently, someone will have to correct me online now, but apparently there was a merchant in Dundee, and he thought he'd got an absolute bargain, and he had this shipload of oranges, and he got them for a real bargain price, and he brought them back, and they were like Seville oranges, which, if you know anything about Seville oranges, you cannot eat. They are so bitter. And his wife was absolutely beside herself, like, you wasted all our money. What am I going to do with all these oranges? And so she played around with a load of sugar and boiling, and marmalade was born. And if you don't like marmalade, I'm sorry, but it's quite exciting for me, because I make marmalade at this time of year. It's the only time you can get several oranges, and it lasts me all year.
Okay.
So there we go.
I didn't know you were going to talk about marmalade.
No.
Was there a point to the talk about marmalade?
No, it's just an origin story. I was thinking of other origins. Anyway, moving on.
We've practiced that one, obviously, in rehearsals. So, yeah, well, if you like marmalade, you're welcome. If you don't, you're still welcome. It's good to see you. Make sure, like I say, you say how's it in the comments. It'd be great to have you. Tonight, we have, exclusively, Josh Edmundson speaking about science and faith. So we're going to get into this whole topic about science and faith. Specifically, Josh is going to be talking about the book of Genesis. Oh yes, he's going to be talking about six-day creation and all of that. We're going to be getting into all of that, which is great. Now, the reason I asked Josh to do this talk, apart from the fact, proud dad, he is actually my son. Josh has just graduated from St. Andrews with a master's in theoretical physics.
Super intelligent. I mean, theoretical physics, what is that about?
I have no idea. I think you just make it up.
Couldn't even begin. Yeah, all credit,
just made
Josh.
Up physics.
Well done, Josh. Yeah. Well done.
Well done. So, Josh he's got his master's in theoretical physics. His girlfriend Abby is doing a PhD in, I want to say, astrophysics. I'm just looking at Sharon, she's nodding at me. So those two have blinding conversations, as you would expect.
That is a high-powered couple.
Yeah, very much so. And so I thought it'd be great to get Josh to it, because whilst he was at university, his scientific understanding obviously massively exploded, but also his faith got stronger as well. So I thought it'd be really interesting to sort of get him to talk about this, because last time we talked about science and faith, you did the talk.
I did, yeah, and I'd love to hear it from a different angle of science, because I'm a biologist, molecular biologist was my PhD, so yeah, that's been my experience. I love it when a physicist starts talking about this stuff as well, because it's like, I don't understand physics really, so it's great to hear it from a different angle. I'm really looking forward to his talk.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to get into that. So no doubt you'll have questions as we go through the talk. After the talk, if you've never been with us before, we go into Conversation Street, which is where predominantly, unless we'll a lot of questions, because I don't know how much I can add to the conversation. But we're going to ask a lot of questions around science and faith, and can these two things work together, and how these two things work together. So whether you're with us YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, or in person, make sure you get your questions ready as we go through it. So I think with that, Zoe, let's roll VT. Let's get Josh on the screen, and we'll be back after this.
So, science and faith. Faith and science, can they coexist? Does faith require you to leave your brain behind? And does science require you to sacrifice all that is holy to an unfeeling universe? Can you be a Christian and believe in science? One of the crucial things I have learned over the past few years studying physics is that definitions are he. Misunderstanding often arises around this issue simply because what is meant by science and what is meant by faith will vary from person to person. Before we get any further into our discussion then, it is worth defining these terms. It turns out though that it is quite tough to find universally agreed upon definitions for either science or faith. So I have had to come up with my own. These aren't perfect, but they will help frame the discussion. Science, according to me, is the systematic, experimental, and rational study of the natural world. It seeks to model how the world works with mathematics and with reason, verifying these models with lots of trial and error. You could make the case that this definition of science is not broad enough, as I completely ignore a definition that gives scope for the social sciences. You would be making a fair point. However, because the discussion of faith and science typically revolves around a few key points that fall under the terms of natural science, I will write up this concern as being beyond the scope of this talk, and we'll move on to defining faith. I found this definition particularly tricky, but then remembered that the author of Hebrews has thankfully already done a lot of the work for me. Hebrews 11:1 says, faith is confident. Did I say confident? Hebrews 11:1 says, faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. Put another way, faith is life-altering trust that God is who he says he is, and that he will do what he says he will do. At first glance then, it appears we have no problem because these two realms seem completely separate. Science explores how the universe functions, whereas faith seems to explore exclusively our relationship with the divine. But we know conversations about faith and science are rarely that simple or cordial. Why? Well, primary points of tension between the two emerge in the creation narrative of Genesis, specifically around the issues of age and evolution. In a paper published in 2020, a huge team of scientists using data from the Planck Space Observatory estimated the age of the universe to be 13.8 billion years. Another paper titled The Modern Theory of Biological Evolution, published in 2004, suggests life itself evolved over 3.8 billion years. The Genesis narrative, however, describes God creating everything within 6 days. Humanity is formed almost immediately after the rest of the universe. The scale difference between these two timescales is, pardon the pun, astronomical. Literally like comparing the radius of a golf ball to the radius of the sun. I first wrestled with this seeming contradiction between the Genesis account and contemporary science when I was a teenager. I was a staunch young Earth creationist, meaning I was convinced that the Genesis narrative was a literal scene-by-scene account of creation. I argued that contemporary scientific theory was clearly in conflict with scripture, that the universe and Earth were young, and that creation happened exactly as described in those 6 days. To back up my point, I cited passages such as Genesis 1:27 and Genesis 2:7 that describe man as being formed intentionally and set apart from the other creatures, as proof Genesis and evolution couldn't get on. However, more than finding the arguments of contemporary science unsatisfactory, I was motivated to defend this interpretation of Genesis by one overriding concern. If I dismissed the Genesis creation account as a myth, where would I stop? I was worried that softening my stance would give me or anyone else license to simply dismiss any other passage of scripture if it was inconvenient, and the whole book, consequently, would lose its value. My whole view of this problem changed when I was about 18. By this time, I was at sixth form, and I was studying advanced maths, physics, and computer science. I had co-founded a philosophy club and was generally feeling on top of my academic game. To stretch myself, I started trying to wrestle with more academic texts in my free time. And it was during this phase I decided to revisit the Genesis debate. I picked up a book called 7 Days That Divide the World. This book, written by John Lennox, Emeritus Professor of Mathematics at the University of Oxford, fundamentally reshaped my understanding of the Genesis narrative. In his book, he offered a nuanced perspective in what I had thought was a binary debate. Either you believed the Bible or you believed science. But he pointed out that in the original Hebrew, Genesis 1 could be read as the setup to a story that began some unspecified time later in Genesis 2. Sort of in the same way if we read a story that went, once upon a time, God created the heavens and the earth. One day the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. We wouldn't necessarily expect God began his hovering right after he finished his creating. The amount of time between those two is ambiguous. He also suggests that the days didn't have to occur in a standard week. He suggested the original text could be read such that an unspecified amount of time also occurred between the days of creation, allowing for an extended creation process, with hundreds to millions of years potentially passing between each day. It was the first time I had encountered such a well-presented alternative explanation of creation that both tried to remain biblically faithful and presented a different view from the one I held. I began to realize that maybe I could ask questions about how we interpret the creation narrative without having to throw my faith down the drain at the same time. If good old John Lennox could sit and think about it for a while, then maybe so could I. In the end, I found the evidence he presented compelling and switched from a young earth creationist view to the view presented in the book, one often referred to as a days of divine fiat view. This was a watershed moment for me. Not only had my understanding of Genesis changed, but my understanding of how I could read and approach the Bible had begun to change as well. I started to suspect there was a depth to scripture I hadn't been aware of before. My academic journey at the University of St. Andrews pushed me into that extra depth without any armbands. As a theoretical physics student, I had to study a wide range of topics within physics and maths that not only dramatically changed how I think about the natural world, but also my understanding of what science actually aims to do. Rather than seeing physics as unearthing the fundamental truths of our universe, I began to see it more as our Lego block attempt to model something far greater and far more complex than we could ever hope to truly understand. And though our Lego model of the universe is incredibly clever and a work of art in its own way, it is still just made of plastic. Simultaneously, my understanding and experience of faith was also undergoing a revolution. I encountered formal theology for the first time, the academic study of God, and engaged in profound conversations on faith with a wide range of friends who studied a wide range of subjects, from economics to history, and even doctoral level theology. There's one evening I remember particularly well. In fairness, it only happened a few months ago, where I found myself in conversation with the head of the divinity school about whether the DreamWorks animated movie The Prince of Egypt, excellent film by the way, should have included the story where God nearly killed Moses because he hadn't circumcised his son. If you don't understand why I thought this was a very bad idea, I would recommend you go read this story, but he made some really good points that I never would have considered. Through these conversations in general, my understanding of scripture has been refined time and time again. Not only did my knowledge of faith increase over my time at university, but so did the breadth and depth of my experience. I got stuck in with a church that I chose. I joined the worship team and started being trained as a worship leader. I led church small groups and helped out with the Christian Union. I gave some of my first talks. I began asking for and receiving words of knowledge. I laid hands on the sick and prayed for them to get well, and sometimes saw it happen there and then. I began to hear the Lord more actively day to day than I had ever thought possible. Even now, I am taking a whole year out to work for the church, and have been actively involved in helping run the worship ministry, as well as start new prayer initiatives. All that is to say, I have learnt a lot, not the least just how much I still don't know or understand. But in light of all that learning, and in light of all that newfound experience, I have come to believe that the scientific interpretation of the creation narrative just does not matter that much. I now hold what you would call a non-concordist view of the creation narrative in Genesis, meaning I think Genesis is better understood by studying the perspectives of authorial intent and the historical context of the readership than by scientific scrutiny. I personally no longer think the narrative corresponds to a set of historical events at all, but I also think it really wouldn't matter if they did. As Steve touched on in his talk, Genesis concerns itself with far bigger things. The author didn't need to convey to the reader exactly how star formation could occur, or how to estimate universal age using the Hubble parameter. Rather, the author, inspired by God, would have been far more concerned with impressing upon his reader just who this God is, answering fundamental questions about the meaning of the universe, about life, and about ourselves in the process. Genesis teaches that God created not because he wanted servants, but because he delighted in the act of creating and in us. It teaches that creation and the material world were created to be good things. It teaches that we are crafted in the image of God and that we are the only piece of his creation to have his breath, his essence within us. It teaches that man has fallen from a good place thanks to his own folly, and it teaches that God is working to bring about good once more. The whole story of Scripture is concerned with who God is, who we are in light of him, and how he relates to us. And Genesis sets that tone. My close friend and one of my favorite poets, Ruby Dunn, sums it up in this excerpt from her poem, Variations on the Planets. If we need anything down here, self-important and soggy and afraid, if we down here need anything, it's to be told we're smaller than we think, but not alone. Not thrown like whittled dice into this pitch arena. Genesis tells us we are not the most important thing in the universe, but we are loved by him, that we were crafted intentionally, regardless of the Lord's methods, and that we have not been left alone. How then do I address the fears I held as a teenager? If I don't think Genesis is best understood as a literal historical account, where do I stop when reading the rest of Scripture? This question bothered me for a while until I realized I already knew the answer. You stop where it seems reasonable. We do this all the time. A classic example would be Jesus' intentionally shocking teaching in Matthew chapter 5, where he says, "It is better to cast out an eye or cut off a hand than have it cause you to do wrong." Now, we don't read this literally. I still have both my eyes and both my hands, and the church in general does not condone lopping off body parts in penance. It's a bad idea. Don't do it. We read this passage and claim that Jesus is using shocking language as a linguistic device to emphasize his point. And we think this way about the passage because, in the light of the rest of Scripture and what we know about the character of God, it is much more reasonable than the alternative. Sometimes taking a passage at face value does it less justice than trying to see it from multiple angles. Understanding Scripture is often hard work and requires deep thought and maybe a little divine assistance. Its content is frequently written to make the reader wrestle with an idea rather than feeding them a neat paradigm. Take, for example, the parable of the sower in Mark 4. Jesus explains he wraps deep truths in parables so that only those who intentionally seek the treasure within will find it. And this is somewhat ironic because he explains this to his disciples and then has to explain that very parable to his disciples because they didn't understand it. If Jesus' disciples themselves didn't understand some of his teaching on first listening, we shouldn't expect to either. Not only is the content of Scripture often a bit cryptic, but we also have to contend with the fact that though the truth Scripture teaches is for all people at all times, it's often written in the forms of a specific people from a specific time. In the opening chapter of his book, Rereading Ruth, the Hebrew scholar William Tooman describes the writing style of the ancient Hebraic authors and how it is dramatically different from how we write today. He says we must actively cultivate new habits and develop new skills to read Ruth well, and these skills are the reading competencies required by all biblical literature. Reading the Bible is not a passive exercise. When you open that book, you aren't just reading words on a page. You're wrestling with the words of the divine, and you are going to need your wits about you. Faith, walking alongside Christ, doesn't require you to follow blindly. It requires you to bring everything you've got, and thankfully, nothing more. Our best efforts are not enough to earn salvation, but surrendering ourselves to a God who is gracious beyond measure with all we are, with all our intellect, our questions, and our troubles, is enough to satisfy him. To end, science and faith are not in contention. Rather, they are largely concerned with different spheres. Science with the physical functions of the universe, and faith with our relationship to God. Though I'm sure scholars will continue to contend over interpretations of creation in Genesis for years to come, I can rest easy knowing I serve a God who, in his generosity, took the time and effort to prioritize penning answers to the deepest questions of my heart, rather than scientific ones. Questions of identity, destiny, and the divine. These are questions that I'm sure you have too. And the answers are all the same. So, if you are considering faith, but have been concerned you would have to surrender your mind at the door, I invite you to bring your intellect, bring your curiosity, and bring your questions. Bring your A game. The Lord can take it. And if you know the Lord already, but feel as though the scaffolding of your faith is built upon a particular scientific interpretation of Genesis, I invite you to take this message as an encouragement. I have wrestled with the questions of faith and science, and have seen my thinking change as a result. I'm sure as I continue to ponder these questions in years to come, the changes will become greater still. You don't need to worry that Scripture will break if you begin to wrestle with it. You can ask questions of Scripture. You can find passages hard to understand, that's okay, and you can bring your deepest concerns to the Lord. I promise you, he can take it.
Very good. Very good. Well, we're back. We're back for Conversation Street, so get busy asking your questions in the comments.
Answer them as well, by all means.
Answer them. I'd love to know what your key takeaway as well is from the talk. So, what did what was the key thing you got out of what Josh was saying? For me, I couldn't get away from the fact his bedroom was really tidy, but that's what can I say?
Yeah, you're looking at the talk from a particular perspective there, I think, Matt, that we don't always share, which, funnily enough, is the whole story, really, isn't it?
Yes.
The perspective with which we look at it. And I've got a lot of sympathy for Josh in that kind of worry of like, but if this isn't true, then what about everything else? And we can totally try and oversimplify all of this. And I like his humility in saying, do you know, there's a lot that we need to grapple with, and then that's absolutely true. And I've been a Christian most of my life, and I totally echo that where I'm at. So well done, Josh. Yeah, keep going with that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, we could talk about what it's like listening to your son do these kind of talks, but I think for Josh, he has obviously had to work through questions of science and questions of faith, and through working through both, he's come out stronger. Is that something that you found?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I don't think I've ever felt that same concern in terms of if I can't prove such and such, then my faith means nothing. Because I think I've been fortunate that my faith kind of went deeper and in different directions quite early on in my Christian life, and so in a sense, I've looked back and it's an interesting debate. Science, creation, creationist, evolutionist. I've been asked many times, how on earth can you be a scientist and a Christian? By people who are really, really incredulous about it. And it always strikes me and go, what do you mean? Why is that even a question? So I don't feel like, I felt like I sort of left it behind quite early on, because actually when you do grapple with faith, when you do grapple with Christ, when you do grapple with the story that the Bible tells, the account the Bible gives of reality, then things like the Genesis account fade actually quite quickly. And I've always had colleagues and friends who assume that if they can just pin me down on Genesis, suddenly all my faith falls apart. And it's really not that simplistic. And so I've always been slightly intrigued by the argument and the kind of heat that the argument generates, because actually for me, I think Josh said it in his, doesn't matter quite as much as some people would maybe make you think it does. So, yeah.
It's really interesting. I mean, the grappling of faith and the grappling of science, I don't know, it feels like it's a bigger issue. People have made it out to be a bigger issue than it actually is, if that makes sense. So there's, you hear a lot of people like Dawkins who will stand up and say, you can't believe in God because of science, which is almost as nonsensical as saying you have to believe in God because of science. Do you know what I mean? It's like you just make these big, bold statements without any sort of sense behind them. And so I'm not a scientist. I remember when you, when you started your talk when you did the talk on faith and so what does the Bible say about faith and science, and you talked about this from your point of view, you reeled off, you're just like, I've got a PhD in this, I've got a master's in this, I've got a degree in this. Some would say I'm a scientist. I can't say that. I have a degree in accounting and I'm still not very good with numbers. So it's fascinating, isn't it? So it's never really bothered me in the sense of, I've been a fan of science, I've studied science, I did physics, I enjoyed it, I loved it, but I've never struggled with science and my faith. I'm wondering, and one of the questions here is actually, have you, being a scientist and probably being more involved in the world of science than someone like me, has that caused you to struggle with your faith?
It really hasn't. As I said, because I think the elements of my faith and what made me believe weren't really about the kind of nuts and bolts of science. It really was two different things for me. So, you know, at university I was studying science, I was studying evolution, natural selection, studying genetics, all these things. For me, it just stoked my faith. It's like it just gave me this awesome wonder in the created order and just how complex it is and how fascinating it was to discover the nuts and bolts of it, to be, I think Josh used that you kind of build these Lego models of reality. Reality is always more complex, and so we must always come really with a lot of humility into the whole debate, because it is incredibly complex. So I was always fascinated by it, but actually my degree and particularly learning about the kind of the molecular level of creation, as I would say, the molecular level of life, just absolutely made me just thrilled at the complexity and understanding the complexity, being given a brain to begin to understand the complexity, and yet within it there's still so much mystery. And I think there's this kind of assumption that if we just keep on using those empirical methods of science and measure and measure and measure and build our models, finally we'll understand everything. And actually science would say, no, that has absolutely not been the case of the last, I don't know how many decades and centuries of research. It just keeps throwing up complexity and questions, and that fascinates me. And so I feel, I feel quite secure in it. But you know, I have to say, if you brought an expert who was really going to find holes to pick in faith, it would be a very interesting chat with them. I don't think I'd be able to give very much back in a sense, but yeah, the humility I think is so important. We love as people to box things off as like creation of the world, done, or origins of the universe, done. Yep, understood that, we proved that, and it's like no, it just doesn't work like that. The complexity is huge, so we need to approach with humility. But it is a very interesting discussion. But the truth is, we will never know. And I mean, one of the why I've always kind of thought about it slightly separately is because the scientific method, the repeating of an experiment to understand or to model something that is going on and to demonstrate what is really happening in natural sciences, doesn't really apply to a single incredible event of things coming into being. It just, you can't use that. You cannot repeat the creation of the universe. It's literally not a repeatable experiment, because here is the universe. So how do you begin to use empirical experimental method? And there's lots of answers to that. You look at the kind of the surrounding of it and the small bits of it, which is where evolution came from. It's like, how do we explain the complexity of life, the diversity of life? And so you begin to find what you can measure, which is on a very small scale. But when you're talking about the origins of the universe, well, I mean, maybe theoretical physics, that's the realm you start going in. That is a kind of little Lego blocks of modeling. But it's not a repeatable experiment. And so, yeah. So again, it's not something that really keeps me awake at night and going, oh, but what if? What if God didn't create the world? It's like, well, actually, I've walked with Jesus all of my life, and it makes so much sense, and nothing else does, actually, when you begin to dig into it. So yeah, it's not a big threat to me.
Which is good news, which is why you're here, Will. But it's an interesting one, and I listening to you talk, fascinating. Absolutely, and again, listening to Josh talk, fascinating about the whole thing, because obviously you've covered this way more than I have. What I can tell you is, in the comments and in the emails and in the stuff that you guys send through the crowd, there's often questions around suffering, and there's often questions around science, like has not science disproved God? Which I think it's fair to say we would firmly believe, no, it hasn't. But one of the questions that came in, and you were talking about empirical evidence a minute ago, and we were talking about this before we went live. One of the comments that came in this week was, you cannot prove the existence of God, ever, so therefore religion should not be a thing.
And that is such a narrow view of reality, to depend upon empirical measurement as your kind of yardstick of, if I can't see it, touch it, measure it, repeat it, which is basically the scientific method, it doesn't exist. It's not real. It's like, and that to me, yeah, you flip it around, the whole idea of scientific thought is to test paradigms, is to test things with experiment. And if you start off with this very narrow sense of what you're going to call real, which is what you can physically measure, well, already you're being very unscientific, would be my argument. There's a lot of rationale in faith. There's a lot of rationale in the biblical record. There's a lot of rationale actually in Genesis about God as a creator, as an authority figure, as making mankind in the image of God, separate, different from the rest of creation. There's an awful lot of rationale in that, even though you can't empirically measure it. And this is where the humility is needed, because we sort of take something like, this is the way we do science, and you apply it to God and go, I can't prove God, therefore God doesn't exist. It's like, well, that's your perspective. That's one perspective. But yeah, it is quite a narrow one, I'd suggest. To insist on God being, going to the way you can measure, and therefore, I mean, it's it just doesn't work. And I think you use the example of like you can't empirically prove love, and you can measure different things that might suggest that someone's in love, but love in itself is like, well, it doesn't. You can't really define it through experiment or by kind of physical measures. That there's something more complex going on there, and I think this is the case actually for a lot of this debate. There's something more complex. So rather than starting off from a very fixed and narrow viewpoint, question. Allow the complexity and go, this is really interesting. I'm going to explore different perspectives, the theological perspective absolutely is valid in this, as is a natural scientist. So don't restrict yourself from the very start, because it'll be a very dissatisfying exploration, I'd suggest.
You live a very angry life. But I kind of wonder with this whole thing, if I approach it maybe from the Christian point of view, that one of the things that I see, we were talking about this again before we went live, I see sort of three groups. I see if I can put it this way, the far side of Christians, the far side of scientists, and in the middle, people who maybe like you, like Josh, who are willing to have a conversation about both things. And so you have Christians who go, we cannot fundamentally listen to anything of science because it fundamentally contradicts what I believe about Scripture. And then you have scientists who go, I cannot believe anything about religion because it fundamentally conflicts with everything I know about science. and then you have people willing to talk. What would you say to Christians maybe who are watching this or listening to this, who have that dogmatic view? It almost feels like they're afraid of science, and I can understand why people like Dawkins would attack Christians on the basis of science, because it feels like for quite a lot of us, we're afraid to talk about it, to go into it, to have different conversations about it.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. That and something levelled against Christians in the debate often is that you do not understand science, and I think that's absolutely valid and true. And not everyone is trained in science, thinks in that sort of way, has that perspective. As I said, that there's a lot of complexity, and so when you don't know about something, you kind of, like with any issue, you find an opinion or a perspective that sort of makes sense to you, but you can kind of hang your argument off because it's like, I'm not going to do a degree in biological science. I'm never going to get to that point of really knowing, so I'm going to look to these people to kind of give me the opinion that I can say. And I'd like to suggest tentatively that Christians can be very arrogant at times, as can scientists, as can everybody. Let's face it, it's a human trait. But there can be sometimes an arrogance in, we know God and God's all powerful and this is what we believe, so you're wrong. That's absolutely not a Christ-like attitude. I would say you don't see very much of that in the life of Jesus, who is the go-to in Christianity. That's our example. We believe Jesus is the image of the invisible God. And so sometimes, it's understood that we won't particularly gain the kind of depth that each side has. But again, I'd just come back to some humility. And you don't have to defend God. You don't have to prove God to anybody. If God is a God worthy of worship, and I believe God is, why are we trying to defend God? Why are we trying to be like, I need to prove God to people? Actually, just take a step back, understand that you don't know everything, and I think Josh elucidated that very well. And I know that journey as well. At 18 you'd think you know everything, don't you? Generally about everything, whether you're a Christian or not. And as you grow older, you realise how little you know about everything. So go on that journey. Don't be afraid to go on that journey as a Christian and say, there's stuff I don't understand. There's stuff in the Bible I really struggle with. That is not a problem. But don't throw everything away because of an opinion. Either way. And as a scientist, don't throw away religion just because it doesn't make sense to you, because you can't measure it. Don't do it. Just keep exploring. Let's be humble.
Let's be humble. So finally, I've got a question here I can answer. So Ollie's put, I love the talk. Key takeaway was that when you encounter something that challenges your faith, the answer isn't to dig your heels in and continue believing in the same interpretation, but instead embrace the challenge and develop a deeper understanding of your belief and reevaluate your interpretation with new information. My question would be, when analysing earlier chapters of the Bible, the Old Testament, can it still be possible to take into account the context of later chapters of the Bible, the New Testament, given the chronology of the Bible may mean that those earlier chapters were written way before the new ones? Thanks for your response. Well, Ollie, I'm going to answer that. I'm going to say yes, you can. In fact, we do this all the time. So we're working our way through Genesis. Coming up in the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about a guy called Abram, or he changed his name to Abraham, who is the founding father of both the Jewish faith and Islam. And it sort of all comes from this one guy. So the sort of center of all faith. Well, actually, we learn a lot about Abraham from the New Testament. So in the book of Romans, which is a book Paul wrote to the church at Rome, and in the book of Hebrews, we learn a lot about Abraham, and it gives us context and it gives us information, which is really powerful because a lot of this stuff was also passed down by tradition. There's a lot of understanding that they had that we certainly don't have in the modern day West. So yes, and I think actually it's a good principle, especially when it comes to the Old Testament, to take something that you're reading and to interpret that in the light of the entire Bible, because God's story is revealed throughout the whole of Scripture. And I think where Christians have missed it over the years is when they take one thing, written in one verse, in one portion of the Bible, and don't understand that in the context of the entire portion of Scripture. And so I think it's a very good thing to do, is the answer, to read around it and to grow in that. I don't know if you want to throw anything in here, but that would be my answer.
Yeah, I'd say the more you read the Bible, the more there's an incredible consistency of God's character, nature, and for me, an explanation of the human condition and our human experience. And you know, that's throughout, and that starts very much in Genesis. And yeah, you're right. If you start pinning your faith on a particular cause or a particular tenet of faith, and ignore again the complexity and the vastness of God and actually our human experience, then you're on shaky ground, really, and it's quite easy to be dissuaded from something in that. But the amazing thing about Scripture, and what's unique about the Bible, and obviously that's the Jewish scriptures are there, and actually a good chunk of the Quran is also can be found in the Bible. That consistency is the amazing thing over so many years, over so many authors, and I don't think there's another comparable document with that same kind of consistency. And not all is obvious first off, and as Josh made the point with the parables, you do need to mull on it and dig into it, and read around it, and that's that is the journey of faith. But it is a remarkable and unique document.
Yes, it really is. Do you guys have any questions in person? You've all been very quiet. Very, very quiet, which is unusual, especially for you. So here's a question, right? The speaker changed his views quite dramatically from a young earth creationist to a non-literal interpretation. Does this suggest that religious beliefs are more about personal interpretation than objective truth?
Oh, that's a well-worded question. I was thinking similarly, actually, when Josh was saying that. And I can see that would be an accusation that could be leveled against Josh or anyone of faith. But again, I think there needs to be humility in it. I think if faith makes absolute sense to you at the age of 18 and you've got it all stitched up, I'd suggest that you're wrong, and you're kind of missing an awful lot. And I think, and that's certainly been my experience as I've grown as a Christian. I look back and think, yeah, I thought I had it, and now I actually understand even less. And yeah, I mean that is the journey of faith. That's what faith is. It's wrestling with things that are not clear and not necessarily understood. If it was all just tick box and very clear and done and dusted, it wouldn't be faith. It wouldn't be a journey. It would just be, yeah, that's what it is. Again, it's a very different journey from the scientific journey. The scientific journey seeks to reduce the complexity into something that we can understand and tick off and go, we've proved that, we proved that, we proved that. We understand everything, which is a remarkable endeavor. But I don't think actually it will end in us having nicely everything boxed off and understood and explainable in a classroom. But in a sense, that's what science is trying to do, because we are naturally inquisitive as humanity. We want to understand. Faith, for those who've been traveling in faith for a long time, it's a very unsatisfying conversation, and I can see how this conversation is very unsatisfying for those who are like, I just want to know what's real and what's true. And it's like, it's not that easy. There's a wrestling, there's a journeying, there's a layers of revelation, there's a lifetime of working it out. That is the journey of faith, and maybe this is why there's such those polar groups that you talk about, because it's a very different approach to truth, really. The faith is kind of walking and understanding the different layers and understanding that it's never going to be completely satisfactorily boxed off, and one day we'll meet God and go, why? What was that about? Whereas I think from a scientific point of view, you want to get to the point where humanity knows everything. And right there is the topic of a talk in a couple of weeks. And that's why we struggle with God, because actually we want to know, we want to be God, we want to understand it all, we want to be able to explain it all, we want to be able to explain it to each other and go, yeah, we have it, we know it. And as we see further on in the account of Genesis, that was the origin of sin and evil.
Is this the talk you're going to be doing, by any chance?
This is the talk I will be doing, yes.
Nice plug. I like it. I like it. It's an interesting one. And also, just another quick plug, Sharon did a great talk. What does the Bible say about truth? Where you talked about subjective truth and objective truth. That is available on the Crowd website if you want to dig into this whole objective, or this whole topic of subjective truth and objective truth, which is another minefield. But it's just really fascinating, and the whole thing works super well. I'd say, I mean, knowing Josh, and coming back to that question, we live in a world which is becoming more and more polarized, more and more convinced that I am right and you are wrong, and the other side is convinced they're right and you are wrong, and we are shouting at each other louder and louder, and we are calling each other bigger and bigger insults. And I think it's a real shame, and it feels like we're losing the ability to debate and to see things from different points of view. And I think whether you're a Christian, whether you're not a Christian, whether you're wherever you are on that scale, I think humility here plays such an important part on both sides of the field. Actually asking questions and not being afraid to ask them, and not being afraid to dig into it and search out the answers, and not being afraid to change your minds. Like, there are views that I held about the Bible when I was 18 and did know everything. And now I'm a little bit older and know very little. I would look at my own journey and go, I have changed how I think about that. But you know what? I changed how I think about parenting as I parented. I changed about how I lead a company as I've led a company. It's okay to develop in your thinking, because that's what makes us human. That's what makes this whole thing beautiful and marvelous. And critical thinking and the ability to think, I just see it as a talent which is diminishing. Do you know what I mean? And we're so busy that we don't have time to think, because we hang around with people that tell us that we're right all the time and don't challenge our thinking. And I think it's problematic, and I would strongly encourage you not to be in that environment, both Christians and non-Christians.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think one of the it's sort of linked to what you said, but I mean, one of the assumptions about the view that science has disproven God is that now religion will just kind of wither on the vine. You know, it's held this kind of superstitious hold over people for all these thousands of years. But now the truth is revealed through science, and therefore everyone's going to change their mind and realise that God is a myth. And you kind of have to look around, and in the field of science and everywhere else, and look at faith and the place of faith in the world and the human experience, and question that, and question, well, maybe that's not how it works. Maybe that's not the reason. That maybe that's not the solution of all this kind of learning, because there is an awful lot of learning. There's an awful lot of research done. There's an awful lot of scientific endeavour, and yet faith, I would say, is as strong as ever across the world. And it's not just blind, stupid people who are too scared to ask questions. It's across the board. And with that increasing revelation of science, of how things work, that's a kind of, sorry, when you do an experiment, you have a hypothesis you want to test, and so the hypothesis is, we find out about this, religion dies, and then the hypothesis, you do the experiment, you've revealed this, and oh look, religion hasn't died. Oh gosh, it's thriving. Oh, people may be looking for something else other than just the mechanics of the universe. and that makes sense to them, and that makes sense to a lot of people, you've got to then question your original hypothesis and say, maybe I've got it wrong here. Maybe I should talk to some people of faith. Maybe I should try and understand this journey of faith a bit more, and the place of faith with my mechanistic way of understanding the world.
Well, you've answered that question, which said, if science keeps advancing and changing our understanding of the world, won't this keep forcing religious interpretations to change too? I think in closing, because I'm aware of time, I would say to you, if you're a Christian, go and explore science. Don't be afraid of that. And if you're not, and you're based on science, go and explore Christianity. Go have some fun with it. Go ask you questions, and go look at it. Because I do think they can coexist. Obviously, I think that I'm sat here with some opinions on the whole matter. But yeah, I hope you've got a lot out of that. Any more questions, do reach out to us. Do let us know. We would love to hear them. Next week, we have... Does anybody actually know what's coming up? No one knows. Next week, we've got something coming on with Genesis. I should have checked this beforehand. I think it's Dave Connolly, or is it Jenny Mariner? No, it's Jenny Mariner next week. So we're talking about, starting to talk about desire. We're going to get into that whole side of things. So a little bit less science, a little bit more psychology next week. We're going to get into all of that, so do make sure you like, subscribe, and all of that good stuff. Come join us for that. It'd be great to see you, both in person, obviously, and online. That is what's coming up next week. But yeah, thanks so much for joining us. We are going to close the live stream down in about 10 minutes time, so at around 8 p.m. here in the UK. We will be on the Google Meet. Go to the website go.crowd.church/meet. It will come up in the comments, hopefully, and it will certainly come up on the end. Go join us there. Come say how's it if you'd like to. Great to meet you. Come talk to either me or Will. We'd love to have a chat with you. We'll be there for about 5 or 10 minutes at 8 o'clock. So we won't be there beforehand because in person, Hugh, Laura, we are going to go do some, we're going to close with some worship. And we're going to be doing that. So we'll see you in that room in about 10 minutes' time. But that's it from me. Anything else from you?
No. Good night. Nice to see you virtually and in person. And yeah, I love what you said. Actually, go have some fun. Go have some fun and explore.
Go do it. God bless you. Have a great week. Bye for now.